Hello again. I'm speaking with Amica Dall. Amica, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, sure. My name is Amica. I'm one of many co-founders of the Collective Assemble. We work across architecture, design, research and advocacy around issues to do with social justice in the built environment, but also just good design, good quality design for everyone. I also teach. I've been teaching at both the Architectural Association and the Bartlett School of Architecture in the undergraduate programs for a number of years now. And I've got a particular interest in working with children, particularly in terms of how the city affects, the physical form of the city affects the kind of quality and character of childhood. I'm particularly interested in children growing up in less privileged, less connected or peripheral urban contexts. And yeah, Ambrose and I met through a project that I started in Glasgow called Baltic Street Adventure Playground, which is now an independent organisation running without any particular further input from me.
You're still on the board of trustees, are you not?
I'm still on the board of trustees, yeah. But it's a very, very, very light role. It's almost entirely managed, run, and strategized for by the local staff who run and manage it now.
How has that been going through the whole COVID thing? How is that? Is it still? I mean, obviously, it had to close down, and Scotland's had a slightly different strategy towards COVID than they have in England. How has that gone for Baltic Street?
Absolutely extraordinary, and I think it's real. There were moments in its development when I was a bit worried that my insistence that we didn't bring in external expertise into the core staff team or management was a bit naive or a bit foolhardy, because there were lots of times when we had real growing pains. But I think the way that the team have coped with the pandemic has been, I think it's kind of exemplary actually, and a real body of evidence for why it really matters to give people ownership of the places that they work and the teams that they work in, and allow for real long-term relationships with the community to build up, even if sometimes that's not the quickest way to, deliver the service or deliver the help, because they have given out over 3,000 tons of food through Fair Share during the pandemic. They had a volunteer team of drivers going from the community who were committed to getting any family that texted them food within the day, some form or another. They had a snack van that was giving out food in areas where it was harder to get down to the playground itself. They had a refrigerated lorry so that they could take delivery of food that other community groups weren't able to manage. And yeah, they really just worked really, really above and beyond. They totally went outside their existing job descriptions and just did what their community needed at that time. And yeah, us kind of board external people had very little to do with that. That was never mandated or suggested. They just took the structure that they had and used it to do what they could.
It's really good. I mean, it kind of, so hopeless segue, I suppose, but it kind of does relate to the text of your talk from the Future Architecture platform. Our words, good enough. You were a keynote, and you can get that. The paper is available online, and it's worth reading. But there's the underlying theme to it, from my reading, and the nice thing about the text is I'm allowed to have my own interpretation by the logic of the text itself. So I can't be wrong here. No, it's that the role of the designer, I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself, is to get kind of close to the social context of the place. And Baltic Street is a very good example of that happening, where you, as the designer, empower the community to such a degree that you're kind of not needed anymore. Insofar you get so close that you kind of become invisible, which I quite like. But this paper, this talk, it's always difficult to work out. Is it a talk or an essay or a speech? Do you do speeches, Amica?
I think it was an essay because it was commissioned both to be read aloud as part of the conference, but also to be published after the conference. So I wrote it as I guess you might call it an informal paper, because obviously done in the tones of speech, but with the expectation that it would exceed the moment of its utterance a little bit, survive it a little bit.
But your job there, or you seem to kind of articulate, you read through the proposals for the conference itself, and you described this sense of being sort of both impressed by the motivations of the presentations on hand, but also kind of, I suppose, is it fair to say, a little baffled by the language employed to describe the social practices being presented?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I would say that, I guess the interesting thing in summary for me is to say you've got all of these different young practitioners from all over Europe. They've been given a fairly open brief, infrastructures of care or landscapes of care, and they can present any project that they want to have some support and mentorship to develop. Any project, it's not strictly a built project, but it is people who are connected or see themselves as connected to architecture as a discipline. And especially considering that people were coming from a huge range of first languages, the character of what they were proposing felt very similar, despite some substantial variations in what they were saying would actually happen, because of the way they were talking about them, because of the language that they were using, because of the kind of tropes they were using, and because of the way they were describing their intentions. And it was interesting because I listened to the previous two annual reflection summaries, and one of the previous 2 years, the commentator had noted, I'm kind of interested that there isn't very much in this about climate change or other kind of contemporary social issues. And I really felt like I'm really struck by the fact that the new idiom, the new normal way of speaking, the new kind of includes a consideration of, I guess, a kind of set of social concerns, but without interrogating them or owning them or nuancing them. There's a kind of like the new vanilla almost, the new context, the new water that you move in when you think about how to do a project includes a set of things like engagement and thinking about stakeholders and how people can participate, and education, like so much education understood as communicating issues, not understood as creating space for people to develop, but understood as communicating issues. And in a way, those practices were taking center stage, and then what people were actually participating in, what they were stakeholders of, what influence they were supposed to have over what time frame and to what ends, kind of disappears behind this like general idea of social practice. And for me, it reads like a kind of new bureaucracy.
Yeah,
it's like instead of running a government department, instead of running a company, your job is to organize meetings in which you set up a schedule of meetings in which you'll run a set of agendas. And, you know, it's like, it's almost like that for architecture projects. It's like an idea that was once somewhat a set, you know, they come from a very radical background, very radical context, some of these words. But they've kind of become a new bureaucracy through which it's normal to take any old kind of project, really. And sometimes the projects themselves might not be that well considered. Sometimes there's a really beautiful intuition at the heart of them. But, you know, it's like they're all being fed into the same spaghetti press or something. And it really makes me wonder whether the actual relationality between two groups of people, the actual power structures that are at play, the deep dynamics that are structuring those relationships are really open for consideration at all. You know, whether there is anything relational, actually properly relational in all this relating that's going on. And the interesting thing for me is that at some point it becomes very hard to tell, because the language is so impoverished by overuse and under-considered use that someone might actually have a very specific idea of what it means to consult or to participate or to invite. An invitation might be a very specific thing, but the language in itself has been so rinsed and been used so cynically, I think often, that people use it to cover up actually a lack of anything meaningful underneath it. That even if there is a very particular intention, a very articulate or sensitive imagination trying to think about how a project lands in the world, how it affects people, that's kind of very easily just like washed over with this kind of gloop. And so in the end, even if there are projects or ideas that do have something more accurate and real and vital about them, they themselves, it can be difficult to pick them out of the kind of the swamp. But I think, you know, that's one thing, but the bigger problem is that actually what that trend does is impoverish our tools, the tools that we have to think with and to discuss what we're doing with each other. And therefore it just becomes much harder to develop a meaningful awareness, practice, research, attempt, you know, like all of those things become harder because no one really knows, you know, you can talk completely cross purposes. Well, I mean, there's no way to get closer and closer to doing it better, because what does better mean when the thing that you're discussing doing better is a kind of like mushy swamp of intention?
I mean, I had a very interesting interaction yesterday evening with a community group which I'm hoping to do some work with. And they are consultation exhausted. So when someone like me comes in, and I'm not being conceited, but I think I have a clearer idea and than some, and I'm being genuine when I talk about community engagement or participation or empowerment. They're weary of it because they've been taken, you know, the communities themselves, particularly marginalized, or as you say, communities who sit within the power dynamic, social power dynamic, are very depressed. And then someone like me comes in again and says, we're going to do some engagement and then some empowerment, and everybody's going to feel, you know, recognized, and actually they've had enough of it. So it's actually, it's a big problem actually when people take words like the word sustainability, environmentalism, and then they misuse them. And but it has been like this for a while, hasn't it? It's been like this since
Tony Blair.
Well, yeah, you know, you've got Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, where she's talking. You could probably take most problems back to Tony Blair, actually. What a guy. But Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, where you're at the lower rungs, you're at manipulation and propaganda. And this is what's happened to these wonderful tools of engagement as well. So it is problematic, but for architecture, it presents this specific problem, doesn't it? Because it's got because we're starting to adopt these words from sociology, and they're becoming generalized in everybody's way. I mean, from the biggest commercial builders to the smallest, most kind of edgy practices, where they're all employing these words, and we're employing it in education as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get past it? How do we stop? Like, what's the solution to this misuse of words?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because like there's one school of thought that would just say other words, like update the words,
Yeah.
leave dead words behind you. And, you know, it's like climate change becomes climate collapse, becomes ecological collapse, becomes a weather system, you know, like you can replace and then just wait for that one to get tired. Or I think there is another process which is a little bit harder, which is a process of rehabilitation, which is about taking responsibility for what you mean when you say those words and re-explaining them in other ways. So instead of replacing A with B, you might have to replace A with a full sentence or with even a paragraph, right? And that's one part of rehabilitation. And the other part is encouraging, I guess, people to really think deeply about what those words mean in order to start using them better. Because, you know, you can go back through history and find, you know, words have been taken up and morphed and changed by power any number of times. Yeah. And the words themselves don't run out, right? We have a responsibility to not let the words stand in for big, vague ideas, but actually think ourselves about what we specifically mean in this specific context by them. I don't think the solution is subbing out tired words for fresh words. I don't think we've just got this like word bench where we should just be rotating. But I also think, you know, there are many, many disciplines, almost every other discipline, many disciplines where the definition and use of words sensitively and accurately is part of what it means to be a scholar in that discipline, to be a teacher in that discipline. And we're incredibly lazy, I think, about language generally in architecture, both learning to write well and also reading enough to become better communicators. Yeah. And I think that, you know, turning to work in other disciplines rather than constantly reading texts produced by architects or architectural historians is another huge possibility, you know, latent. It's just waiting there.
I agree. I fully agree. And you talk about this idea that in architecture, that we use these words to in a way denote and connote a culture. That what architecture does is it kind of takes on sustainability or takes on participation, and then that gets embedded within the cultural discourse of architecture, and is used therefore as a tool to reconsolidate architecture's kind of status as a very specific type of practice. So these words, which could have the possibility of breaking open the shell of architecture, this kind of big male-dominated enterprise, are instead absorbed inside the shell, and the shell gets a little bit thicker and a little bit harder. And we kind of...
Yeah, you sound like Adorno. This is like the argument of the cultural industry, right?
Yeah. I've never said anything original in my life, so that barely surprises me.
No, that wasn't a criticism at all. That wasn't a criticism at all. No. I think, I mean, who has? I think that it's very interesting, though, to recognize that these are trends and patterns that have been recognized in wider culture for many, you know, coming up for a century, right? And that also we can use other people's scholarship to understand them better. As well as to, you know, to understand what's happening when those cultural ideas get subsumed into a different culture and essentially you know put to its own ends. The reinforcement of architecture you know, these arguments were made about the reinforcement of capital and the culture industry rather than culture as it's an everyday thing. I think, yeah, I think
you make this lovely point in your, I quote, how we talk about things matters because it's the closest we can get to describing how we think, and how we think matters because it shapes, animates, and sustains what we do. I think that's a very nice way of putting it, but it's difficult, isn't it? And this is, again, jumping the gun a little bit. As teachers in architecture, to get when we're working in this culture of architecture, which has these very refined boundaries, it's defined itself beautifully over the century or so of its professionalism, or however long it is. It's been a long time, but not that long. It's very difficult to then start cracking that open with these alternative viewpoints, sociologists and urban geographers and cultural theorists and philosophers and dinner ladies and you know, people who actually live in, but you know, it's very difficult to then end up starting to teach that, simply because the culture of architectural education and practice is so strong. It's almost impervious to alternative ways of doing it. What I mean is that we train students to design objects, and objects that are quite big, very big in some cases. And they don't have the time to think about how all of these subtleties get embedded or maybe transform the project itself.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, we don't have time to give a thoroughgoing education in critical reflection of the style that you would get in a rigorous humanities degree, for sure. But how we are talking all the goddamn time in architecture education. Students present their work verbally. Most teaching is verbal, like we do mark up each other's drawings, but basically, you know, it's a subject which is done through talking and talking about drawings. And you know, the main vehicle that we have is the crit or the jury or the review, whatever you call it in the particular school or context that you're at, but basically you're getting verbal input from people. So actually we are inculcating a potentially hidden curriculum, or implicit, what is actually the right word, not hidden. There is a very strong implicit curriculum, which is learning how to talk like an architect. And learning how to talk like an architect at the moment means getting pretty free and easy with some fairly, and being very lazy, I think, in a lot of sense, with some fairly important ideas and terms that deserve a lot of respect and reflection. And you know, we can either just ask ourselves to talk more simply because a lot of the time the meanings aren't complex, we're just explaining them in a complex way, or we can take more responsibility for the way that we use language as teachers. I think it's absolutely stunning how active you have to be about that. I really note how sometimes when I've had what I think has been a fairly sensible and grounded set of conversations with the student, they'll then present in a formal context, like in a school review, and suddenly they'll just be talking this completely other language and saying these things that I've just never heard before, because they've just sat in loads of reviews and heard other students saying them, you know, and saying wild things about their projects, which are not things that they've thought about or worked on. So I think it goes beyond the responsibility of individual studio tutors. I think there is a pressure on students to sound impressive, which is more important than being simple and rigorous, you know. And I think that's slightly the consequence of the fact that you have to learn so many things in architecture, or there are so many different sets of things you can assemble to be your education. But I really feel like, yes, whilst we don't have time to get them to engage directly and deeply with those texts as primary materials, we're constantly talking, and that is the main substrate from which they feed as students.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we do. I mean, you're right that perhaps humanities education, they would get to dig around in these more humanistic concepts more, but we do a huge amount of interaction in architecture. But I want to move on from that. This idea that you outlined.
Though, Ambrose.
What's
Sorry.
That?
I was thinking that when you were talking, but I didn't actually say it. This idea of how much interaction we get as architecture teachers and students. I think that's one reason why the cultural forces become. That's one reason why the field is so unified in many ways, because the legacy of the generation that's teaching on the generation of students is immense, because they're tutored so much, they're seen every week. You know, there actually isn't the kind of lonely space where you spend hours, you know, working through things for yourself that you might get in other disciplines. And I think that is a very powerful influencer on the kind of hegemony of the culture.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Anyway.
I certainly think that that's true. I mean, I've noticed this recently. The more feedback we give students, the less satisfied they are with their feedback. Every time, every single time. When I was a student studying architecture, 98 to 2001, we didn't, I mean, I can't even remember getting feedback. I mean, we got shouted at, and we got given, no, I mean, occasionally, no, very little written feedback, almost none. And now it's almost ludicrous. I mean, 600-word mini essays on 2,500 word essays. I mean, that's what we're getting up to now. It's like 500 words. You write 500 words on a 2,500 word essay of feedback. I mean, it's just, well, for a start, it's just an unsustainable workload. But secondly, I don't think it helps anybody.
No, I don't think it helps either. Because it becomes with rules, and then it's their job to try and guess what you want rather than yeah.
But this lovely idea that you've got in here, that you noticed also in a lot of these proposals, this use of the passive voice. And I think, again, coming back to this, so these words like empowerment, engagement, mediation, whatever it is, and the architect or the designer talking themselves out of the project, and then talking also about the community that they're interacting with in this passive voice as well. So everything becomes extraordinarily abstract. And I did, and you proposed that, you know, people need to move into the active voice, and that's obviously a good thing to do. And that is probably the legacy of you as someone trained in literature, to understand that. It's certainly someone who's not trained in literature, it is a temptation. And my thought on that was that it gives the gloss, it's tempting to do because it gives the gloss of objectivity. It makes you feel like you're being objective if you take yourself out of the equation and you talk about people like avatars, or like ciphers, or, to use an architectural, like Le Corbusier's Le Modular. You turn the community into a stable entity, and you turn yourself into a dispassionate observer of that stable entity. And therefore truth is available because that's what our paradigm says is relied upon, or is the only reliable way of achieving truthful engagement. So I wondered if there was something in that, whether we could perhaps take less maybe give ourselves a little bit of a break, in that we're just trying to be objective here.
I just think, you know, what you just described, nothing could be further than the truth. It's just like such a struggle to know what to do anywhere. And you always end up just sort of making a guess, going on your intuition, doing the best that you can with the available evidence, and having a go. And I think it's so interesting that on the one hand, we've got this move towards the passive voice and this idea that of objectivity, and talking about our projects as if they were the result of empirical experiments. And on the other hand, you've got a whole generation of students who seem to be paralyzed with anxiety about making design moves because they're constantly worried about getting it wrong. And if you think about it, those are just two deeply contradictory messages. On the one hand, we're saying, just have a go. There's no right answer. You have to make a proposition, be propositional, as in come up with something new and put it down and see how it works. And you're a designer, as in you're not a researcher. A designer it is a creative discipline where you are projecting a somewhat arbitrary and particular idea into the world, right? And you try and do that as responsibly as possible, but that is ultimately what you're doing. And constantly when we're talking to students about drawings, we're like, just draw something, you know, give it a go, do 20 elevations, see what sticks, like do a bit of modeling. And that is totally counter to the prevailing mood of discourse, which is, like you say, trying to position architects like more objective than any social scientist would ever actually think, or, you know, be brave enough to think that they were, in that there should be a correct answer and that they should come up with the correct answer for a situation and be able to talk about it as if it was the solution. Whereas, you know, architecture is very different to that, actually. And I think the second dimension of the passive voice, which maybe I didn't make very clear, but I think is critical, is that it's the voice of authority.
You touched on that, and I did want you to open up on that idea of authority.
Well, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just very interesting because I saw that you were implying that there was this kind of power dynamic at play, and there was some kind of implication that it was to do, but I didn't fully get that. So I'd be grateful if you would kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not clearly expanded in the essay because it's still a bit of a nascent thought, but I've got a strong intuition that you know, power doesn't just use the third person, it does also use the passive. And I feel like, for me, it feels like a bit of a hallmark of the kind of authoritarianism that pretends it's not ideological, you know. It's like,
but this is a really fascinating idea, because I wrote down in my notes, I wrote down about this idea moving to that the passive voice is this kind of tyranny of being objective, not emotional, not empathetic, because those words tend to smack or have become culturally associated with ideas of mission, of evangelism, of ideology, and of belief. And these things are not cool. And so you've got, they're not accepted. They're very real though, and they very much exist. But you use, as you say, you use this passive voice, and it gives you this white coat, this scientific white coat, doesn't it? And then you can walk around and make truth statements.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally reality denying, because dominant architectural culture has a very strong set of ideological alignments and assumptions and implicit structures. And if you don't admit your beliefs and empathies and human reactions, you're not having them, you're just pretending you're not having them.
Yeah.
And that's the tool of power, right? Because power says my intuitive reactions are truth and yours are secondary, particular, cultural, you know. Mine are neutral, yours are particular. And so it is a nasty trick, actually. There's a nasty trick in there. And I think it's something that does seem to intuitively confuse young students. Like they don't know what's wrong with it necessarily, but it doesn't sit right. You know, they end up in this paroxysm of inaction, because on the one hand, you know, they're being told to think through and with less powerful groups. And on the other hand, they're being told to do so in a way which continuously reinforces their power and neutralizes any meaningful difference or diversity between your interests and where you're coming from, and where the people that you're working for or with are coming from, even if that's just the most basic difference, which is you're getting paid and they're not, when you get professional context. But you know, that's just the beginning of it.
I mean, that's a really, really interesting idea. And there's this other thing that I thought your project, your essay touched upon or implied was the issue of human needs. So you talk about getting close to the person, to the people that constitute these tropes of community and things like that. And this idea of getting close and actually engaging, insofar as the word has a meaning, is kind of anti-human needs. That the non-engagement engagement is based around a kind of, I think, a Maslowian idea, Abraham Maslow's idea of a hierarchy of human needs, where you can actually identify a stable set of values that could be applied in Timbuktu or Margate. But your approach is to say that we need, by getting closer, we can go beyond that has no purchase anymore, or its purchase is lessened. And so I'm kind of interesting that this idea of breaking apart this this Maslowian idea, because I do think it is right at the heart of it. So as architects, we go in with a series of assumptions about what these people need. And you see this very clearly in post-disaster reconstructions of the Global South. People need a shelter, and they get given a shelter by the Ford Foundation or Gates Foundation or whatever it is, World Bank. And it doesn't work. It never works in any meaningful sense of the word working. And instead, this approach that you're talking about is very granular, very kind of situated and immediate and emotive and empathetic and all of these things. But the question I always have about this is, how do we scale that? How is that scalable to the context of the crisis to hand? Be that the climate crisis or the urbanization crisis, whichever way you want to phrase it.
I just don't know if this is the question I have. Like, does it need to be scaled? Do we need a scaled approach, or do we just need lots of people who are able to work in a more granular way? And I think that's always the question. I mean, there are situations like disaster relief where, yeah, someone has to make some pretty big decisions pretty quickly, but also the fact that someone outside the situation has to act at scale is an artifact of a power dynamic, a set of infrastructures that reinforce the situation in the first place, that reinforce the need for scale. And I'm much more interested in what kind of large scale collaboration and cooperation would allow many more people to act and work in a more granular way, because I don't think it has to be more involved. I don't think it has to be more involved in some senses, but in terms of hours and in terms of resources, capital resources, I'm just not sure it does. Like, it doesn't have to be boutique. I think you actually, first of all, just have to say, am I sure that any decision that I make for these people will be better than any decision that they can make for themselves? And then divide up the situations to the few instances where that might be the case in terms of like sewage planning, or and then really be very serious about the instances where that's not the case. Because I think we've got so far as architects into fetishizing the individuality and the particularity of design schemes. You know, we celebrate these ones that just take us a few steps away from standard, but into territory, you know, but with a kind of standardized set of expectations about what people want and need. Nevertheless, that we're not even asking in a deep way, is me doing these houses in this objectively high standard design better than, actually better when we look at the resources we're putting into it, not just money, but intellectual and also structural, giving people a bit more agency. And I feel like it doesn't always have to be asking other people to do things for themselves. I think it's also just a question of understanding architecture as a more local practice, as something which can consider supply chains and construction technologies in order to enable them to be more local, granular and diverse, rather than just the organization of information towards increasing standardization. And that sounds a bit anti-architecture, but it actually very deeply isn't. It's just anti a very particular kind of architectural thinking that I think we're a bit trapped in.
Yeah. Well, that's I think really brilliant, and kind of comes to the last thing that I wanted to ask you about, though, is so we look back in the history of kind of these kind of radical practices, people who have challenged this hegemonic idea and the power dynamics within architecture, and I think about people like Coop Himmelblau, and there's a very good essay written by Dana Cuff, I think it is, in the Sage Handbook of Architectural Theory from 2013.
Send that to me. I don't think I've ever read a Sage Handbook of Architectural Theory.
You've never read it? I teach it. Total nightmare. No, it's actually quite good, but she talks about the way that discrepant practices, as she calls them, are permitted within architectural culture, not as she calls it enfolding. They get re-enfolded, so they move to the edge, to the avant-garde, as a sort of strategy of the center. So the center utilizes the avant-garde to consolidate its own power. And so for me, a lot of what we're talking about speaks of a new architectural culture, but architectural culture is so strong that it takes on these radical practitioners, these these derivé kind of situationists and so on and so forth, and makes them work for totalitarian regimes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the question you always have to ask is, are you shifting the boundary, or are you going up to it and then retreating? Because, or are you even perhaps setting a beacon on where the lighthouse is? Well, no, are you setting a beacon about where the boundary is? And this is an argument that's been made by critical theorists, economists, sociologists for decades and decades and decades. The idea that international aid doesn't upend power structures, it reinforces it. The idea that everyday philanthropy is like a safety release valve that actually contains discontent rather than channeling it and allowing it to accrete, because everyone can work out, do something very small in order to feel in some ways that the psychic pressure of their disagreement with the way things are organized is released without actually endangering the underlying organizational structure. The argument is made like super famously by Zizek, who, I wouldn't refer to often, but I think he is so accessible for ideas like this that it's worth it. The idea of a fair trade coffee. He's like, fair trade is the biggest con of them all, because all you're doing is just doing a slightly better bad thing. You're doing the bad thing slightly better. And therefore, anyone who is suspicious that the way that maybe we trade in these commodities isn't great has got somewhere to go, but somewhere to go that's still thoroughly contained within the existing order. And I think, like, in terms of culture, that's that's an incredibly powerful force, and you see it time and time again in music culture, in art culture, that there's a re-internment.
So on a more
sublimation is the word that the philosophers would use. Subsumption.
Say that again. The
subsumption is the word that
subsumption
philosophers use.
What a nice sounding word that is. So you've got people like, so globalization. So we're talking, I think a lot of these things are about this kind of globalization of cultural practice, where you get, your great architects, they ride out and they do their thing wherever it is, probably designing buildings on airplanes as they fly from one city to another. And we have to kind of resituate ourselves in the local and the contextual. And this is wonderful and it's positive. And I fully agree with you in this. What does it look like though? Like, what does that architecture actually look like? Does it have a different buildingness? Is it visually different? Is it spatially different?
I just think almost the idea that it has to be uniform, that it has to have a connected set of characteristics is the thinking from the old school a little bit. But there are things that it isn't, because there are certain kinds of buildings which in general are very rarely robustly useful enough in their context that if they were imagined and built in a thoroughly localized version of the architectural industry, it would be very hard to imagine that they could exist. Certain kinds of glass and steel, certain kinds of high rise, certain kinds of infinitely flexible floor plates feel like they're a product which would rarely occur in a system of architecture that was more deeply localized. I guess I'm taking for granted that if we were able to localize architectural practice, there would be meaningful localization of supply chain and labor as well.
Yeah.
Because, but you know, I think that done thoroughly, that's what that would mean. Yeah. And so
yeah,
you know, like trying to understand it as genuinely a fracturing and a dispersion and a professional dispersion as well. You know, that the practice of being an architect might vary significantly, not just legally, but in terms of what you actually think about, region to region, not just legislative, you know, not just nation to nation. Yeah,
that's brilliant. I'm going to suggest, and you can contest this, but I'm going to suggest in 3 words what we've talked about, perhaps what your essay is about, which is an escape from sureness. I think that's what I take away from it. Like, we as architects have a culture which insulates us from vulnerability, and it insulates us from critique, and it insulates us from the community. I mean, that is, as we talked about this, we hide, and it insulates us from being political and social and good and all sorts of different things, and it produces great results. I mean, there's on the occasion there are some wonderful buildings that are thrown out, wonderful shapes, wonderful things to look at, wonderful sensory experiences. But I think you're right in that, for me, what you're articulating, and it chimes with me, so maybe that's all that's happening here, is that I'm hearing what I want to hear, is that we have to escape from these surenesses if we are to address, or at least try and address, some of the pressing social, economic, environmental, cultural issues to hand.
Yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable.
It's going to be uncomfortable. Okay. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you ever so much, Amica.
Thanks, Ambrose. My pleasure.
Really, really enjoyable.